Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.
Talked about post-traumatic stress on the show before. We've even talked about moral injury with some really good guests, informed guests. That really good is not actually a comment on their moral status, but we have talked about the different elements that sometimes soldiers and sailors and aviators bring back with them from war. We've actually even talked about PTS in foreign correspondence and war journalism. We know it's something, as the listeners know. I've had my own journey with PTS where I got to be a model also as an ambassador for PTS. So for those people that only listen to the show and don't look me up on the internet, I'm a good-looking rooster. But that has nothing to do with PTS or the topic today. G'day listeners and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast, the only podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. And I know that because I haven't looked it up. I'm sure no one's out there trying to copy me, though, at least in terms of name. I'm sure in form and content we are the exemplar show. That's not true. I stole the format from other people, and also the topic is pretty, well, it's everywhere. Unique would be the term that an artilleryman or a combat engineer in Australia would use. Thank you again for all our premium subscribers on Apple. I hope you're enjoying the Battles series. The Battles series might be something we take to the masses, either late this year or maybe next year, where we have Daniel going through case studies of battles. At the moment, a lot of those battles are at random, which is good. There's no real coherence to it, but it also is different each time. So jumping from Gargamella to Jena Orstadt is a bit of fun. But we're not talking about that today. Today we're talking about something called mission injury. Now this piqued my interest. Obviously, listeners, as I said in the intro, I've got an interest in PTS. I've got an interest in moral injury, both from a lived experience point of view from my time in Afghanistan, but also from my support to veterans charities, veteran engagement and mental health. People might know in Australia we now have the Royal Commission into Defence Suicide and Veteran Suicide and mental health. Now that is wrapping up this week as we record, so if you're listening to this in 2024, we are recording in the first quarter while that Royal Commission is wrapping up, and hopefully by the time you listen to this, some of their recommendations are starting to be implemented. Unfortunately, I think that might be different. However, I stumbled across a paper on mission injury. Now, I don't know much about mission injury. I read the paper. It's good, but I was like, I need to know more. And as you know, what do? I called the person up and asked them to come on the show. And then about 6 months later, I actually end up scheduling a proper interview, and then we come on and we chat about it. One of the good things about being this podcast host that you all love and adore is that I get to talk to heaps of interesting people, and sometimes the bad thing is it stops me doing further research on a topic because I'm like, hey, I've got a scheduled chat for that. But that's okay because it also means I get to talk to experts, not exports. I don't export anything apart from this show, and it doesn't come under any controls, but experts. Now, my guest today is Dr. Kelly Atkinson. She's a political science at the RAND Corporation. Her research includes human security, international security, gender policy, the Women and Peace and Security Policy Agenda, diversity and equity and inclusion, childcare, and military personnel readiness issues. She has published peer-reviewed research on gender and conflict, refugees and development, women in the military, extremism in the military, the future military force post-Afghanistan, and women and security as human security policy succeeding winning hearts and minds, coin doctrine. Kelly earned her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from the University of Virginia, a Master of Arts in Strategic Intelligence Studies from the American University, and a Master of Arts and PhD in Political Science and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Ohio State University. Now, Kelly is also a military officer with over 15 years' experience in both the full-time and reserve roles in the US Air Force. And it's worth reminding everyone, as with all of our guests, but Kelly's opinions expressed are her own, and they are not those of the RAND organisation or the US Air Force. Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Kelly, we'll get into the details of mission injury so we can talk about what the issues such as PTS, moral injury, how they operate and sort of combine or what they actually mean in the mission injury context. But first, let's talk about you. So I invited you on here to talk about the topic, and the first question is actually about you. So what motivated you to become an academic of war?
Great question. I think you are the first person who's ever called me an academic on war. It's certainly not how I think about myself. So I had to stop and think about this. I think of myself more as a gender scholar who happens to be in the military. And I think part of that is because my first degree background, like you mentioned, is anthropology. I always sort of thought of my experience in the military as observing and seeing how it works and watching how it works and being part of it, but also thinking critically about what is this thing that I've joined. When I think of my own background, it goes back to 9/11 when I was a 15-year-old in high school, and I grew up in the same small town in Pennsylvania my whole life, not from a military family. But when 9/11 occurred, I remember watching the coverage on the television and thinking, I want to be in New York so that I can do something, so that I can help. And so after that, I went to my high school counselor, who was a wonderful mentor of mine, and she brought up the idea of Air Force ROTC, where I could get a scholarship, I could go to college, and I could participate in military training and then join the military afterwards. And so I researched it and I joined it, and my first day of Air Force ROTC training, I fell in love because it was leadership training. I had never really experienced that before. And so from there, I studied anthropology, I studied the Middle East, I studied Arabic when I was in college because it was very much the post 9/11 GWAT phase. And I was being trained to become a military officer in that world. I finished college and commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And I spent 15 years on active duty as an intelligence officer. During that time, I always knew I was interested in academic study, and I knew I wanted to get a PhD. And part of that is because I'm just a nerd. I really like school. I like study and research. And I thought I would finish my time in the military and leave and go to school, to grad school. And meanwhile, the Air Force developed a program where they wanted to send junior officers to grad school for 3 years to get a PhD at a civilian institution, to grow and develop networks with non-military thinkers. And then once you finish that degree, you would come back into the military operational assignment structure and use those connections and that strategic thinking to shape military strategic policy. So that's actually what I did. I applied for that PhD program. The Air Force sent me to Ohio State. It's the first time I studied political science, the first time I studied critical feminist studies. And I loved it. And I was able to really think about these broad concepts like grand strategy and realism and liberalism and all these political science ideas behind war. And I also studied feminist critical thinking, which is one of the impetuses behind this piece that you mentioned. So I got that training, and then I came back into active duty and was lucky enough to be assigned to the Air Force Academy, where I was teaching political science. And that's really where I had the space and the room to think about these topics and to write about these topics and to teach amazing people, amazing cadets who would go on to become officers. So that was where I think I found my footing as someone thinking about concepts of war, of who the people are within these structures of war, of what this all means, and really of how this shapes and impacts the people who are participating in the military and these systems.
It's interesting that the number of guests we have on the show, I call them in the millennial, or some of us are elder millennials, how much 2001, 9/11 impacted our careers. So that was my first year at the military academy, and I remember watching it after the production of Les Mis at at our academy, so we're all watching it late at night in the common room, and I'm standing next to Jean Valjean. He wasn't dressed as Jean Valjean, but he still had the makeup on. And then, we all kind of saw where our career was going, and a lot of us ended up doing language studies like you. I studied Arabic for a year because that was what was the important language at the time, right? So it's fascinating to understand how people's careers were shaped by that pivotal moment, and then how they went on and evolved with the changing policies and nature, and then obviously the ongoing war in Afghanistan and Iraq to some extent as well. Iraq was a little bit more in stages, but particularly Afghanistan, a war that we lost, and letting people understand that still is I think a little bit difficult for those that serve there, but also just something that politicians like to avoid. So it's interesting to understand and see how people's careers are shaped by 20-year period where that was the flavour of the month and type of warfare, but now a lot of people are engaged in helping the community deal with the past 20 years, but also prepare for the next 20 years of conflict, which is arguably going to look very different. And we see that in Eastern Europe at the moment. Now, in your article, you introduced the concept of mission injury, and I'm not someone who runs around saying I love concepts, but this is a concept I love. That's not true, actually. I'm one of those people that always says it. So I'm not a concept whore, though, people. This is a concept I really like because it touches on both a professional and personal interest of mine. And it's a new way of explaining something that a lot of people kind of understand. There's, PTS survivors like myself that a lot of their issues come more from the way we went about things and created the trauma rather than actually the trauma itself, right? And there's a lot of work on moral injury around that. There's also a lot of work trying to argue against moral injury, which I find interesting as well. But when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is very interesting. Kelly, can you please elaborate on this and how it is discussed and is different from other issues such as PTSD and moral injury, especially in the context of Afghanistan's fall?
Yes, thank you so much for this question and for reading the paper and for liking it and wanting to talk about the concept. I wrote this paper after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in the end of 2021. And I wrote it almost as a piece to process the anger and the frustration that I was feeling, to see how things played out. Because as you say in the discussion, this was a failure. The U.S. and our allies, and I can only speak from the U.S. perspective, but we failed in our goals in Afghanistan as evidenced by the Taliban's taking back the country after the U.S. withdrawal and our allies and partners. And I was really upset and I was very angry. I was disappointed, and my colleagues, those of us, like you said, the millennial generation, we were shaped by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's how we grew up. That's how we spent our career. And when we saw the withdrawal and the failure, I looked around and saw my colleagues feeling this pain and this sadness and this disruption of seeing everything go wrong. It was actually really interesting because a lot of my colleagues had been deployed quite often in Afghanistan, and they had translators. And so they were getting calls from their colleagues still in Afghanistan saying, can you please help me get out? So it was a very, very human impact to be witnessing. And so I began by writing the piece that I have, the article that's published in Aether, the Air University's journal on air and space power. I actually wrote the op-ed part of it. There's sort of this conceptual editorial letter on when you think of veteran, this is what you should keep in mind. And I wrote that as an exercise in processing the feelings that I had. And then after writing that, I turned this into more of an academic piece. And I present a theory of mission injury, which is a phrase that I coined, and it reflects upon moral injury. I think many people are familiar with the phrase, the idea of moral injury and trauma. And I call it mission injury because when I think of moral injury and PTSD, I imagine that as a very personal, individual level experience. So when we think of moral injury, we think of someone who has participated in some action while in the service of the military or in perhaps another institution. And that then incites trauma in that individual and may cause PTSD later. when I think of mission injury, it's a different level of analysis. So moral injury is that person, that individual, or maybe a group who participated or conducted some sort of activity. Mission injury, I say it's the trauma that occurs when the military member or the military population determines that the sacrifices that they conducted over an enduring period of time were not worth the mission's outcome. So when we see the failure of Afghanistan, when we see that this mission that, again, I'll say the U.S. military because that's my background. I don't presume to talk for other services. But when the U.S. military sees that we withdrew from Afghanistan and we failed in our mission, and look, the Taliban took back over, then it might cause the individual to think, well, I guess we failed, it wasn't worth it, so what did I sacrifice along the way in this military lifestyle in service of this mission? And if the mission ultimately failed, then was the lifestyle that I've been in for the past 10, 15, 20 years a waste? Did I miss my kids' birthdays? Did I miss my parents' funerals? Did I get divorced? Did I miss having friends and family? All of this is sort of part of the military culture in the United States, particularly. But if the mission itself fails, then you stop and you start thinking critically about the culture that we all participate in order to support the mission. And so that's why I think of mission injury as it's an individual experience, but it's a reflection of an institutional level dynamic.
I love the approach at the institutional level, particularly in the context as a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. I'm affected by this as many of our colleagues. And one interesting thing is a different show we used to produce with co-host Richie. We produced a show called War for Idiots, and we did an episode on the history of the conflict of Afghanistan. We scheduled the recording for the week that Kabul fell and the evacuations started. And we didn't know that was going to happen, obviously, except that my co-host had recently been a planner over there. And so it was very real for him. We had to reschedule it. And then I think it was the only time that I'd ever had a glass of whiskey while I recorded an episode was while we were doing it. And it's interesting to see how people's lives are shaped around it and how politicians haven't necessarily engaged with it. And things like mission injury could be a really good way of explaining current workforce retention issues, and then also the same impacting factors that are causing recruitment issues. And I know that in Australia it's very public knowledge that, and it's put out quite a lot, that the Australian Defence Force has a massive shortage in its recruiting targets. And for the first time in a very, very long time, and I'm talking decades and decades and decades, it's failing to recruit the right numbers for certain roles and certain combat roles that we used to just have, in the past, just young men lining up at the door to join. But now you have this retention issue, people leaving because they're like, why did I do that? And then what was that all about? And then you have the very, very real element of, if you're joining a military that was in the war in Afghanistan and you're a volunteer force and you're looking at it and you're like, well, why do I want to join the losing team? Obviously, they're not going to go join the Taliban. Their recruiting criteria is a little bit stricter in some ways. But it's a real issue from a political level as well. And that's why I think this is such a great concept. And I do know that I've got some political staff who listen to this show. When you're talking to your principals, if they work in the defence space, jump on this, because this could be something you can campaign for and just throw a heap of money at fixing it. You can't do that. You've actually just got to make better decisions around war. Now, Kelly, how do you see the feminist analytical framework you applied in your study changing the conversation around military personnel's experiences and institutional responses?
I love that question. And I think what you just described is really what I would say about it. I think when people hear feminist framework, they think this must be having to do about women.
Yeah.
And in a large way, yes, the feminist theoretical approach emerged from female scholars saying there's something that's missing in this conversation about politics or whatever medium you might want to think. And I think of the feminist analytical framework as giving us two things that help us in these conversations. The first is that it points us towards paying attention to previously ignored topics or populations. So in this traditional feminist analysis, that would be Cynthia Enlow's famous question of where are the women? If something's happening, where's the other side? Where are the women? We should think about that. Here in the military, I think paying attention to what are the individual level experiences of the people who are actually in the military. This is not simply a system of budget and aircraft and tanks and fighting a war. The people are what make up the military. So where are the people? What are they thinking? What are they doing? So exactly what you just said, Mick, is like, why would we expect people to want to join the military? I think leaders in the past 20 years have benefited from the assumption that people will want to join the military because there's an ongoing conflict that has a nationalistic or a moral pull. So people like me joined the military who never had a background in the military because 9/11 occurred and I wanted to do something. I wanted to serve my country. We cannot assume that that motivation will continue now and into the future. So the feminist analytical framework gives us the perspective of taking away those assumptions and thinking we need to pay attention to what people are actually thinking, what they're wanting, what they're experiencing in these daily interactions of life, and how that's shaping their calculations about what they want out of life. So that's the first contribution. The second contribution of the feminist analytical framework is that feminist scholarship looks at power, interactions of power. So again, we want to think about where is the power, who has it, and what are the relationships where power comes to play. So again, when we're in the time of GWAT, people are willing to make sacrifices in terms of moving all the time or deploying and not seeing their family members or not maintaining relationships because of the military structure that demands a lot of them, because they're motivated by this goal to serve their country and contribute to this effort. Now that the GWAT time is over, and when I say GWAT, I mean the 20 years of global war and terror, what is the motivation that people have to serve the military? And again, we cannot assume that people will want to join, because often when joining the military, you give up a sense of personal agency to be part of the greater whole. And so we want to think about those questions of power and agency. People want different things out of their life. They want more flexibility. They want more choice in their career. They want more ability to have a work-family balance. And the feminist analytical framework has a history of looking at those calculations, particularly for women in the household dynamic. But now we can use that rich history and apply it to the military setting. What are the work-family balances that people want out of life now? What are the calculations and the sacrifices they're willing to make in service to their country, in service to the military, but also with the desire to have that personal agency and be able to have more control over their choices in their lives? I think for so long, there haven't been recruitment and retention challenges. And so senior leaders haven't really had to think critically about talent management. But now we're in a moment where they do. And I think mission injury points us. It says, look, there might be a problem. People might actually be stopping and thinking, what have I done? What have I dedicated my life to? Was it worth it? Maybe it's not. Maybe I'll leave the military. Maybe I won't tell my kids to join the military. And we actually have to pay attention to those human dynamics if we want to keep thinking about military strength and military power.
That's a great intro for anyone who doesn't understand what feminist analytical frameworks are, as well as, I won't say scathing report on the past 20 years and the way forward in terms of institutional responses to the way the mission went, but very, very, in my experience, quite accurate to how people are thinking about it. And I know that the US military is very famous for the different types of campaigns for recruiting. And, I think the US Army even had or Marines had an animation. There was a computer game for the US Army, maybe in comics. But just lots of different ways of engaging their audience. And as in my daytime, I'm a comms professional, right? So I love that stuff. In Australia, we've shifted up, and we're no longer advertising people for people to be recruited into the services. It's only join the Australian Defence Force. It'll be really interesting to see how that goes, because there's barely a piece of military equipment in any of the advertising they now use to recruit people into the military. It's all about work-life balance and things like that, which is tough because you need to do things like attract people in terms of employment when you have an all-volunteer force, but then you need to be able to go and get them killed one day you have come along and joined. So it's an interesting balance. I like the question, where is the power at? And I would say, the dynamic in my own household, where's the dynamic at? I'd say wife, kids, dog, then me. But maybe I should run it through a framework and see if that's actually true. I still think that it's actually true. But now we're going to go into a premium subscriber question. Now, this is a question that those listeners who subscribe on Apple Podcasts to the premium channel, they get to hear this question. For those of you that don't subscribe, I still welcome your listenership. I would welcome your money if you want to join Apple Podcasts. But if you're not going to join the premium channel, that is fine. I'm going to get money off an advertiser whilst I chat with Kelly on this question. You get an ad. And if the ad annoys you, well, you know what to do. Sign up, become a premium subscriber. That keeps the show going. Any tin that is thrown towards the show keeps the lights on. As many of you know, I have a separate career to podcasting, and that's so that I can feed my family. So I don't see this as ever becoming a full-time role for yours truly, which is fine because I want to inform you. I don't want to bleed you. But if you got some tin, some spare change in your pocket, why not throw it our way, especially in this tough economic time? I know it's tough for you, so don't worry about managing that money. Just give it to me and I'll manage it for you. We'll take a quick pause. And we are back. And interestingly enough, I did not say anything nasty about those audience members who do not pay for the premium question. I'm lying. I really slagged you off. But that's okay. We had a very interesting discussion around the impacts on military members, their families, and institutional responses. So if you're very interested in that stuff, and I know there's quite a few academics I interact with here in Australia who are interested in that, and all my mates in the military are definitely interested in that because I see you all living these very challenging lives, balancing both military service and family life. So if you liked it, throw some tin our way and I'll let you in so you can listen to the question. If you don't want to talk about that, well then just keep listening to the ads because then I still get some money. Now, Kelly, strangely enough, this show's not about making money, just that section of the show. So what we want to do is get everyone back on track while they're getting their credit cards out to talk about institutional changes that alleviate the personal and family sacrifices in military service. Like, you actually suggest some in your paper, which is great. And you're probably living the rather enjoyable moment of making these very, very sensible recommendations and just not getting any engagement on them because big institutions very rarely read stuff and engage on these sorts of recommendations unless they pay a highly overpaid, massive consultancy firm, which I won't name any of the big ones, but they're all the same ones in Australia and the US, and the UK. They're all the same companies. And then they write a report and then they have to implement it as well. Now, I say that as business consultant for a small Australian company where we can come in and do it cheaper. No. This is really important. So what are some of the specific changes you believe are crucial for Western militaries to implement?
I think there are ongoing efforts that are working towards this. I think there's great news ahead, and I want to draw attention to the efforts that are ongoing. In the paper, I mentioned some of the work by barrier analysis working groups in the U.S. military. So these are congressionally directed volunteer organizations, volunteer groups that are aiming at data-driven research for barriers to full participation in the military and proposing research-based solutions for those efforts. One I've been involved in is the Women's Initiatives team in the U.S. Air Force. So this is a group of volunteers, men and women, who think about barriers to women's full and meaningful participation in the military and then propose solutions. This might be anything from childcare to uniform wear to aircraft design to access to reproductive health care. These efforts have gained traction over the past 5 years. I didn't know they existed in the first 10 years of my military experience. In fact, the story I told myself when I was getting ready to join the military was, Kelly, this is a man's world and you need to learn how to adjust into it. And at the time, that was very much true. And over the past 5 years, we've seen collective action. We've seen groups of people coming together under the structure of congressionally directed barrier analysis working groups to say, hey, this is a problem and it's impacting a lot of people. Here's a solution for it, and provide the solutions to senior leaders. Now, it's up to senior leaders to listen. And I think often there are challenges where people who are at the top of an institution have been raised and developed through that institution. So they're a product of the norms and the rules. And so why would they want to change it? Because it's in their best interest to keep the institution the way it was. That's what produced them. And so that's kind of a perspective. We call that the frozen middle, sort of that senior level, sort of the colonel level who think, no, like, why are you proposing changes? It's great the way it is. So you have to get over that, and you have to find the right people who say, no, let's change this institution, let's make it better, and let's adapt it to make it more inclusive for the people who are in it now. Specifically, what are the things I think should change in the military or for Western militaries? I think number one, childcare should be free and guaranteed. I think if you want people to serve the military, you should provide them safe, guaranteed, standardized childcare. I love the military childcare system. All three of my children are in it or have been through it. The teachers and staff do not get paid enough, and military members are on quite an extensive wait list to access it, as well as government civilians. I think if you want to reflect the population of service members now in the military, you have to understand, like what you said earlier in this podcast, the nuclear family is not the same as it was in the 1950s. Yeah. You don't have one service member who has a family supporting them. Our service members look different now. We don't have the nuclear family where the male is the service member, the female wife is the spouse managing the kids as they move. That's not what it looks like anymore demographically in the United States. Or I haven't studied this, but I would assume in Australia and our Western allies as well. So let's change our institution to support that. So free and guaranteed childcare. Anyone listening out there, I think that should happen. And there are people doing work on this. I think investing in the women, peace, and security agenda is key to understanding how human security dynamics can shape internal military design and external partnerships. Australia is a leader in this area. They're doing amazing things with WPS. The U.S. military is now getting up to speed, so I think we need to continue that and catch up to our allies. I think addressing military spouses and families and continuing to invest in transferring licenses and certifications so that if you are still moving military families as often as you do in the U.S., you're making it as easy as possible on the spouses if a military member has a spouse. Better yet, I think we need to rethink why military members are moving as frequently as they are. This is a construct of a structure that was put in place in the post-World War II era. And we all know that institutions are path dependent. They're set up and they will continue to run unless you hit a critical juncture and change a structure and change the institutions. And all these rules are just rules that we've created for ourselves. So there's a moment where you can stop and you can say, does this structure make sense anymore? Why or why not? And let's take an opportunity to change it. So I think, again, if you want to ameliorate some of the costs and sacrifices on military members and their families associated with service, we can rethink some of the things we just assumed that they should do, like moving around as frequently as we do. The last thing I would say is continue to invest in research and programmatic efforts to disrupt and dismantle sexual violence in the military. It's a pernicious problem. It affects more people than one would think. It causes trauma. Why would you want to serve in the military if it traumatizes you physically and mentally and emotionally? When I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, mentoring cadets, trying to help them through some of these dynamics, it's really demoralizing and it breaks your heart. And I think, again, going back to the feminist analytical framework, it's a result of power structures. You set up the military system based on power structures, chain of command, training, following orders, and with that becomes an abuse of power that impacts and causes sexual violence. So I think ultimately, I am a constructivist. I think of institutions as created. This is Alexander Wentz theory. He was one of my mentors at Ohio State. And with that comes the opportunity to say, it doesn't have to be this way. We can reshape it and redesign these institutions to not only reflect the current goals we have, but also to reflect the current population we have serving.
It's good that you're a constructivist because you wouldn't be on the show any other way. There's only certain epistemological and ontological frameworks and axiological frameworks I allow on the show. No, that's not true. I've interviewed people that are very black and white, but it's good to have some theory words thrown in there and for the listeners to think that I understand them. Now, the frozen middle. The frozen middle is a great name. I'm going to steal it. I'm going to use it. I call them enemies of the free world. Middle management is the enemy of the free world because they are the one thing that doesn't change because the system worked for them. And it was something when I was middle management, I was always using in meetings that phrase, and it would piss people off. It would upset them. They're like, what are you saying about? I'm like, I'm not saying you're bad people. You're just enemies of the free world. We've got to think about how we can change things like this. Sometimes works, sometimes didn't. I use it in sales pitches too sometimes, and it works. Now, the nuclear family, I like that because I think of families as stories, and one of the main stories in our family, or one of the story is that, for a long time, my military career, I thought I was the main character. And I was shaped and institutionalised in thinking I was the main character. And then when my wife's research really started changing, like having a real impact on Australia's education system, I was like, wait a minute, I'm just the supporting character, possibly even a non-playable character right now. And that helped me make my decision to transition because I realised that, there was something that was different about our life than the story that I was told it should be, and the one that I'd believed, right? Not saying that I was a complete dinosaur. Obviously, I had the epiphany, but still, it was a long road and nowhere near as easy for my wife, who actually is doing amazing work, changing parts of Australia and education. So the main story is different, right? We have different character arcs now for each of the people in the nuclear family, and institutions need to respond to that. And the moving so often element of that answer, this has been something that I just haven't, as a student of history, just haven't understood. And having done some time serving with the UK military and seeing how they have the same issues, but they also have home regiments in a way, and they have people bouncing back to their units. Being in a small army like the Australian Army and trying to understand why people need to move from Darwin to Townsville, right? They're both tropical locations with poor opportunities for families and education. Townsville's a little bit better set because it's on the east coast where most of the Australian population lives, but you sit there and go, well, maybe the people just don't need to move between the two. And anyone who gets posted to Brisbane, which we call Bris Vegas in Australia, which resembles Las Vegas in no way apart from the fact that I think Australians just thought that sounded cool. No one's ever going to move from there. And I know guys that have done nearly their entire military career here because they've managed to find ways of doing that, but it's come with significant career impacts. You pretty much accept a ceiling rank and you stay that ceiling rank if you want to bounce around those locations. So all things that really spoke to the heart of my military service, which is quite a few years behind me now, but is a thing that I'm still seeing and still seeing people post in and out of the city that I live in because they have to tick the boxes for their HR structures and the careers. So a real interesting and significant list there as well. One thing I like, and I think it's something the guests like, is not the guests, the audience. Hopefully the guests like it too because they're guilty of it. But having guests that come on here and say, "Hey, this is what I think needs to change for people to understand that," which is important because topic. And as I said, I see you as an academic on war. You see yourself as a gender studies academic who war is just the lens with which you look through it. And I completely understand that that's probably more the case. But for me, it's about standing on that other side of the lens and seeing it. So we're going to get back to war now. Although we've pretty much discussed war the whole time. The workforce of war. Oh, that would be a great title for this episode, but that's not what I'm calling it. Let's talk about the final sentence. This is what I say the only fee a guest will ever pay on the show is answering this last question. And this last question relates to Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, and what he tried to do with On War and what his wife had to finish for him. And it's which, hey, let's get some gender academics on that whole thing. I mean, we've got Vanya out there doing great work and writing the book on Marie von Clausewitz, but hey, that's a story in itself, right? Like the fact that the greatest Western military theorist out there, his wife wrote the book, right? That's a really good one. But let's get back to the question that just popped into my head. I need you to finish a sentence, and this is something that every guest gets, and they come on the show and they do it, and we're in the hundreds, 110 plus episodes now. This is probably 118. This is close to 120. This episode might even be 120. I haven't thought about that yet. So we're really close, and that means there's also slim pickings out there in some ways. But I no longer limit people to a tweet character length, and I don't get too many Clausewitz answers anymore. But can you please finish the sentence? War is.
War is something to be avoided.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone has said that before. And I also do not mean deterrence. I don't mean build up forces to deter war. I mean that at its heart, at its core, philosophically, war is something to be avoided. I think there are a lot of dualities that come with military service. I'm very, very proud of my military service. I'm very proud to be a military wife, to be a military mom, to be a veteran. I'm very proud of being a product of the Air Force and the training and everything they've given me. I'm proud of my deployments, and I'm proud of the colleagues, and I know my colleagues feel the same. We are proud to be in the military. And yet, I don't think any of us want conflict and violence and war. And so I think those two things can exist at the same time, and they should. And I think we should honor that perspective that human loss and destruction and violence is something that we should all avoid, even as we might participate in the military service. I think we can think both things at once. My dissertation research focused on grave violations against children in armed conflict. So really the worst of the worst. And if we keep that perspective in mind, if we think about who is this impacting, who is war really, no kidding, impacting children and vulnerable populations, then it's something that we should avoid.
That is a fantastic answer, Kelly, and it speaks right to the heart of where I want to go with this show, which is a convincing. People don't understand this show is a pacifist show. This is an anti-war show, right? And people don't get that sometimes. But you're war junkies who probably haven't experienced it if you don't get that. Training and for the big game, but never wanting the big game to happen is a really weird thing. But it's something it's one of those dualities that military people deal with. Kelly, thank you so much for being on the show. I've got a border collie in the background that's telling me it's time to let you go and keep changing the world with your research. So I'll let you do that, but thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick, for the work that you're doing and for the chance to talk with you. I really appreciate it.
Now, listeners, you can check out Kelly's article at Ether. That's the Air and Space Journal from the U.S. Air Force Air University. So the University of the U.S. Air Force. There'll be links in the show notes. Read it, understand it. Read it, don't understand it. Just make sure you check it out. It's a fascinating framework and one that will speak to people trying to understand institutions, trying to understand people, and trying to understand mission failure and what the impacts of that are. Please subscribe if you're interested. If you're not interested in subscribing, that's okay. Just listen. Tell your friends. We really appreciate our listener base. We've been doing this for 8 years. Who knows how long we'll do it for, but the only reason I do it is because people actually come back and let me know that they listen to it and they engage with it. Otherwise, some of these early mornings would not be worth it, but it is worth it because you listen and I appreciate that. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.